here's the Punna Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 105, and we're going to briefly look at the parallels for this sutta. Now, as you can see, this particular sutta has 6 parallels, and by parallel, what we mean essentially is a text that scholars have determined is likely to share a similar historical source. Parallels are rarely identical with the original text, but nor do they merely share some kind of surface similarity, right? So there's plenty of times where you'll have like a phrase or a teaching or something will be repeated, and that's not enough for something to be a parallel. To be a parallel, it has to look like it probably is a version of the same text in some way, or at least part of that same text. And so these little arrows here indicate that these are different parallels. So here the parallels are, the first version is in Tibetan, in the Vinaya Vastu. So this is the Tibetan Vinaya, which is the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. This is in the Divya Vedana, in a section of that called the Purna Vedana, literally the story of Purna. And so this is a Sanskrit text, also of the Mula Sarvastivada tradition. So this is the Samyukta Agama in Chinese translation, also of the Mula Sarvastivada or closely related tradition. So even though we have 3 different versions here in Tibetan, Chinese, and Sanskrit, actually from the same or very similar traditions in terms of backgrounds. And when we see the parallels, we see that in fact they are, where they differ from the Pali, they are usually the same. And here's another couple of texts. This one also Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, and this one I am not 100% sure where that appears. Anyway, so I'm not going to go into too much detail as to the parallels, but I am going to refer a couple of times to them, and especially to the Divya Vedana text, which is in Sanskrit. And so that's great because the Buddhist Sanskrit texts are fairly rare. Divya Vedana is a collection of stories, which is mostly a later collection than we find in the suttas. But like many of these later collections, a lot of it consists of compilations of material, or at least some of it, compilations of material, which is just found in the suttas as well. So even though the collection as a whole is late, sometimes the material can be quite early. Okay, so let's have a look at this sutta. Oh, I should just mention something just one of my personal, grievances, annoyances, pettinesses is that people often pronounce punna as punya and punnavada as punyavada. It's not punyavada, there's no Y sound there, it's purna, as if it's got an R in it. And you can see that the Sanskrit version is spelled with an R, purna. So if you pronounce the Pali version a little bit like that, purna, then you're not doing too badly. All right. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. Then in the late afternoon, Venerable Purna came out of retreat and went to the Buddha. He bowed, sat down to one side, and said to the Buddha, "Sir, may the Buddha please teach me the Dhamma in brief. When I've heard it, I'll live alone, withdrawn, diligent, keen, and resolute." All right, so this is an interesting trope, which we find a number of times throughout the suttas, and it relates to the way that people would do retreats. Now, these days we're very familiar with the idea of a retreat, and we're familiar with the idea that just basically you can go from your life and just exit it and then go and do your retreat. But that's not really how it was done in the time of the Buddha. Also, it's interesting to note, though, that retreat wasn't something that was imposed by the Buddha. He's not going around telling people, "Oh, now's the time that you need to go on retreat." The Buddha was very undirective in that way. He waited until people came to him and said, "It's my time to go on retreat." Sometimes he would say to them, "Not quite sure that you're ready yet." And so that would be the end of that. But in this case, obviously, Purna was ready, or it seems that Purna was ready to go on retreat. So he was quite happy to support him to do that. But Purna had already been ordained. He'd already been in the monastery for a while. He'd already trained. He'd already practiced. And he was at a point where he felt that this was the time for him to take that next step. And I think it's really important to remember that retreat is something which is supposed to support you at a certain place along your spiritual journey. It's not for everyone all the time. It doesn't solve all of your problems. And it's not something that you can use to like push or to fast track your growth and your spiritual development. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience, that you go on retreat and you have a very nice retreat and you have some very nice meditation and everything's great. And then you come off retreat and the number one question that people ask towards the end of a retreat is, you know, how do I keep this going when I'm off my retreat? And the answer is, of course, you can't. If you could, then why would you have taken a retreat in the first place? So that's just how it is. So don't see a retreat as being something that's going to help you to sort of leapfrog or to push your practice in a kind of new way. It's a part of your journey, and it's a part of something that allows you to experience meditation and peace at a deeper level than you could before. But it's not some kind of magic trick. But when the time comes, when this is going to be the right time for you, you'll feel something. You know, you'll feel a yearning or a longing to change, to transcend, to do something different. And that yearning or that longing will be something that you will somehow know in your heart. You might be mistaken about it, but at least you'll think that you know in your heart. Whether or not you really know or not will remain to be seen. Anyway, so this was the custom in those days, that when they felt that they were ready for a retreat, they would go to the Buddha and they would say, okay, I feel ready, please give me a teaching in the brief. And then they would take that teaching as a reflection to use in the retreat. So what was that question? And here we go once more, sharing this window. Again, hopefully, okay. So the Buddha said, Purna, there are sights known by the eye that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. If a mendicant approves, welcomes, and keeps clinging to them, this gives rise to relishing. Relishing is the origin of suffering, I say. There are sights known by the ear, smells known by the nose, taste known by the tongue, touches known by the body, thoughts known by the mind that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. If a mendicant approves, welcomes, and keeps clinging to them, this gives rise to relishing, and relishing is the origin of suffering, I say. There are sights known by the eye that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. If a mendicant doesn't approve, welcome, and keep clinging to them, relishing ceases. When relishing ceases, suffering ceases, I say. There are sounds known by the ear, smells known by the nose, tastes known by the tongue, touches known by the body, thoughts known by the mind that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. If a mendicant doesn't approve, welcome, and keep clinging to them, relishing ceases. When relishing ceases, suffering ceases, I say. So this was the brief instruction by the Buddha. It's a teaching which is based on these 6 senses. And appropriately, it's in the last chapter of the Majjhima Nikaya, where all of the suttas deal with the 6 senses. This chapter is similar in that way to the Salayatana Samyutta, that is to say, this part of the Samyutta Nikaya which deals with the 6 senses. And indeed, in the Chinese versions, this sutta does in fact belong in that sutta. One of the theories of the formation of the Buddhist canon was that many of the portions that we currently find in the Majjhima Nikaya and Digha Nikaya especially were originally in the Samyutta Nikaya, and it seems that this whole chapter, Samyutta, the Salayatana Vagga, was one of those sections, and quite possibly at an earlier stage in the development of the canon, it actually formally was a part of the Samyutta Nikaya or Agama. All right, so here the Buddha is pointing to this well-known teaching that we have to be restrained in our senses. Of the 2 great frameworks for understanding that the Buddha used, the 5 aggregates and the 6 senses, the 5 aggregates is more orientated towards letting go of views and self-identity, and the 6 senses is more orientated towards letting go of sensual desire. And we are constantly receiving this kind of stimulation through the senses that provokes some kind of response. And it's important to understand that this is not something which is determined or fixed, but which is a feature of how mindful we are, how careful we are, and how restrained we are. So it's not a matter of not seeing things and not hearing things, not tasting things, not touching things, but of being careful and restrained in the way that our senses work. And one of the tricks that the world of the senses plays is that the short-term pleasure that we get from the senses has a long-term cost. And of course, you know, we know in many cases, we know this. We know, for example, if somebody's shooting up heroin, that it feels great. And like, it's the most awesome feeling that you can ever have to that person at that time. And in the long term, then the effects of that are going to be the exact opposite. Not only will it create painful feelings, but it also will leach away one's capacity to even feel pleasure. And so the long-term effects of things is going to be the opposite of the short-term effects very often. So yeah, thanks Anne-Marie for posting a couple of those links. We had a request from Venerable Sukachito to welcome Venerable. Good to see you here to speak. I'm not sure how we're going to be managing that, Anne-Marie, but I will let you enable that if we can. Meanwhile, I'll just keep going, okay? But please interrupt me.
I think if Bhante wants to speak, if it's okay for you, he can unmute himself.
Okay, please, Venerable, if you still want to speak. I'll keep going in the meantime. I'm not sure what's going on there. Okay. Now, Venerable Analayo points out that in the other versions of this sutta, there is a slight difference here. And I'm just going to pop one of the other versions of this onto the screen just so that we can see this. Curious. Okay. And this is the Divyavadana version. So this is from a Sanskritic text of the Mulasarasivada school that is from the northern part of India, based originally around Mathura. And this is a late collection of all kinds of stories and includes this particular story. I'm just going to try to find the relevant bit. Where are we now? And I just want to sort of illustrate how similar this version is to the Pali version, because it is in fact very similar, but it has some interesting differences. Where are we now? Let me try again. Here we go. Right. So what I want to do, in fact, can I do this? I'm going to do this, and you're going to have to tell me. I should have the Sanskrit one on the left and the English one on the right. Is that correct? Is that what I've got here? Can someone give me some feedback on this? Because otherwise I don't know.
Bhante, you've got the Sanskrit underneath the English.
Underneath? That's not what's on my screen. Oh well. Because I can't see them both and the thing at the same time. So, okay, but you can see both screens at the same time. Okay, that's the main thing. I'll come back from this view quickly. I won't spend too much time with this, but I just wanted to highlight here. Here's the beginning of the actual teaching. Santiko in the Pali, Santiko Purna Chakuvinyeya Rupa. And in the Sanskrit, Santi Purna Chakshu Vijnayani Rupa. So it's basically exactly the same as the Pali. Ishtakani, Itta, Kantani, Kanta, Manapani, Manapa, Rupa, Priyani, Kamupasanhita, Kamahitani, Rajniyani. We can see here that when we say these things are parallels, and I just want to point this out because a lot of the times the parallels are in Chinese, and it's a bit more difficult to establish the exact similarity. But when we can see a Sanskrit parallel, even in a text which is, quite late and quite, I'm going to mute all if I don't mind, because there's a bit of noise coming through. If someone can unmute themselves. Thank you. So even in the case where, we have a text which is quite removed in time, like the Divyavadana, the wording is not like similar or like reminiscent. We're talking about literally exactly the same words with merely a slight change in the dialectical form compared to the Pali. Of course, not every case is that similar. And this case is also a case in point because the Sanskrit continues with a few lines which are not found in the Pali. And this is also the same in the Tibetan and the Chinese texts. They have these extra lines. The fact that they all agree in this case doesn't mean that they're more likely to be more authentic than the Pali text because they all come from the same school. So they would be expected to agree. So which one is earlier or later is unclear, but the first line is basically the same, and then it goes on to just to spell out that process in a little bit more detail. So first of all, the holding on to it, just as the Pali does, giving rise to what I've translated as relishing. Anandi is here, and then when the Anandi is there, then Nandi Saumanasya, the delight and pleasure arises. When delight and pleasure arise, then desire and lust arise. When delight and pleasure is there, then when there is delight and lust, then Nandi Saraga Sanyojanang Bhavati. Then there is the fetter of that delight and lust. So that's basically what the extra lines in the other versions say. So as you can see, it's not, we're not talking about any kind of new doctrines or anything which is particularly different than the Pali, but it just explains the same thing as the Pali in a few more words. All right. So this so far is the bulk of the teaching portion of the sutta. And okay. So, all right. So before I go on to look at the narrative portion of the sutta, does anyone have any questions about that? If you're familiar with the suttas, then this is probably familiar to you. If you're not familiar with the suttas, you're probably thinking, oh my God, I can't see anything now or taste anything. Don't worry. It's all right. You can still see things and taste things. If there's no questions, I'm going to continue. We good? Looks like we're good. All right. Okay, so I will read the next portion because I'm not so interested in the details of the Pali text for the next portion. Purna, now that I've given you this brief advice, what country will you live in? And the word I've translated as country here is Janapada. And normally with the Janapadas, you have the 16 Mahajanapadas, which are around the region that the Buddha lived in the northern Ganges Valley area. And so one of the things that's interesting about this sutta historically is that it's telling us one of the very first stories of somebody who's going outside of that region, right? And we don't know like exactly where Sunaparanta is, but my understanding is that it's probably to the west and probably towards the region of modern, where is it? I've forgotten now. Probably towards the region. In fact, we might have it on sort of central. Let me just see. Sort of central has a map. In case you didn't know, and I'm not sure if we've got Sunaparanta there. We do have Sunaparanta there. Ah, excellent. I will now share my screen again. And this one. Great. Okay, so now we're sharing and we have Sunaparanta. There you go. And this is obviously a bit of a guess. We don't know the exact location or the exact boundaries of it, but that's more or less where Sunaparanta is. So if you go to find this kind of map on Sutta Central, it's just an embedded Google map, but if you search for a place name, and then if we have that place name there, it will tell you where it is. So according to our best guess, Sunaparanta is in modern-day Gujarat. That is basically on the west coast of India. And so you can see that that is a very critical, strategic area for trade, especially trade with the West. And we know that trade with Rome became huge not long after the time of the Buddha, first with Greece and then with Rome. And before that, obviously, there would have been trade up the coast with then Persia and so on. But in the time of the Buddha, then this was still very nascent. Okay, so within like 100 years or a little bit later, then trade with the West was normal. It was like a huge prospering thing, and this difference happened under the Mauryan rule, which unified India. But at that time, it was still just sort of coming to be. And you can see that in this sutta, there's this kind of feeling that, you can see this big cluster of things over here. This is basically where the Buddha lived and taught. And so Sunaparanta is like right over here on the extremes. And we hear a few stories from over here on the extremes, but only very few. And you can see even in this sutta, like there's this kind of feeling of a bit of suspicion, like what are the people like over there, right? They must be weird and so on, because they're not really in our civilized place. So these stories, I think, for me, are very interesting because they tell us something about the attitudes of the people and the growth of not just of Buddhism, but of trade and civilization throughout the region. A little bit later than the time that we're talking about here, there's a Jataka story which talks about the origins of trade with Persia. And according to this Jataka story, when a ship went to trade with Persia, then the ship, a crow was on the mast of the ship when they traveled. And when they arrived at the land of Persia, they sold all their goods and they're about to return home. And one of the Persians spotted this crow. Now, of course, as we know, there are no birds in Persia. Well, I don't think anybody here actually knows that because I'm sure it's not true, but this was the belief in India that there's no birds in Persia. So when they saw the crow, they were so amazed. What is that incredible creature? Oh my God, they've never seen anything like it. How much can we offer you? Can we offer you a basket of gold? Can we offer you I'll offer you 2 baskets of gold for this bird. And they bargained them out. And then the Indian sailors couldn't believe how lucky they'd been and what fools the Persians were. So they just looked at each other and they said, well, next time we're bringing peacocks. So again, the fact that these stories can exist tells you how nascent that the international trade was at that time. And one of the reasons why this is interesting is because it's one of the things which we can use to locate the suttas in time and place. Because if this text was written a couple of 100 years later, it wouldn't have these same attitudes towards people in these far different lands. All right. So Purna says he will go to Sunaparanta, basically Gujarat. Sir, I shall live there. The Buddha says the people of Sunaparanta are wild and rough. If they abuse and insult you, what will you think of them? If they abuse and insult me, I will think these people of Sunaparanta are gracious, truly gracious, since they don't hit me with their fists. That's what I think, Blessed One. That's what I'll think. So, well, I don't know. I mean, the Buddha's making some assumptions about these people in this far-off land. I don't know how justified that is, what he's making the assumptions based on. Maybe he's heard stories. I don't know. Maybe he's seen them in his psychic powers. I don't know. But certainly we can say that it's common to see people who are different from us, who are other, as being wild and rough. And I mean, it's not entirely, I mean, that projection of violence on the other is not entirely, what I want to say, it's not entirely, I don't want to say it's unjustified, I want to say it's not entirely, I mean, we can understand why that happens, because when we go to somewhere that's new, very often the people who greet us there will be wary, right? I mean, you know, when people are in their place and a stranger comes in, you're like, who's this? And so that's very easy to get this impression that people might be violent or might be dangerous, when in fact they're just suspicious of a stranger. And once you get to know them, then you realize that that isn't the case. And I'm hoping that that isn't the case. All I can say is that here in Harris Park in Sydney, we have lots of folk from Gujarat, as from the rest of India, and they seem like lovely people to me. So I'm hoping that either things have changed, or that perhaps the Buddha was, or at least the Buddha as depicted here, was mistaken in characterizing them in that way. Of course, the main point about this is the Punna's response, and to response with kindness and graciousness to their attacks. But then what happens if they hit you with their fists? What will you think of them next? If they hit me with their fists, I'll think these people of Sunaparanta are gracious, truly gracious, since they don't throw stones at me. That's what I'll think, Blessed One. That's what I'll think, Holy One. So Punna is patient and forbearing to a very high degree. But if they do throw stones at you, what will you think? If they throw stones at me, I will think these people are gracious since they don't beat me with a club. That's what I'll think. But if they do beat you with a club, what will you think of them then? If they beat me with a club, I'll think these people of Sunaparanta are gracious, truly gracious, since they don't stab me with a knife. That's what I'll think. Now, I mean, we're hoping that these things didn't happen, but of course, one of the realities of life as a mendicant in those days is that these things did in fact happen. And, you know, when we read it in this kind of sort of escalating sort of challenges thing, I mean, it's got the format of a joke, right? And it sounds quite humorous, but people did throw things, and they did throw rocks and clods of earth at monks. And we know that in stories, Buddhist stories, like the story of Angulimala, where that happened to him. And in the Jaina texts, which are more or less contemporary accounts, it happens more often. The Jains were much more confronting, I guess. You know, they were naked. They didn't bathe, and so, you know, to see them coming through your town would be much more challenging than to see Buddhist renunciate. And so it seems like their scriptures, Jaina scriptures, talk about this thing a lot more than the Buddhist scriptures do. But the fact that it's talked about in both of them suggests that it definitely was a real thing. And, you know, I've been lucky in my life as a monk. I've never been attacked. But I have had some gnarly glances. I have had some people yelling at me. When we were here in Harris Park, the one and only time in the last couple of years that we've had a negative reaction was when a Muslim lady came up to us and said, you know, what are you Buddhists doing to the Rohingya people in Myanmar? You should be ashamed. And we said, yes, you're right. We should be ashamed as Buddhists that we're doing this. And she said, you know, how can you wear this yellow robe, which is the same robe that those people are doing? And we're like, well, this robe was around a long time before they were doing it. And so I think, you know, I think she was, you know, understandably upset by what was going on, but you could see that there was that kind of exposure to those things. But anyway, so far I've been mostly lucky. A number of years ago, somebody asked a question online, what is it like for a Buddhist monastic to live in a Muslim country? Do you get exposed to any threats or any violence or anything like that? And I responded to it by saying, I lived in Malaysia for 1.5 years, and I never found anything but kindness and warmth from the people of Malaysia. But when I spent a few weeks in America, and the locals decided to call the cops on me for the crime of existing and being different, I guess. So it can happen when you're among the rough and barbarian people of the uncivilized nations. Okay. Sorry to any of my American friends who are there, but you know, I'm an Australian. We have to crack these kinds of jokes. Okay. Now, of course, one of the things that this whole sort of narrative then raises is that kind of question of like, well, is this saying that we therefore just have to put up with violence? And obviously, there are a lot of situations where we shouldn't just put up with violence. Right? In the cases of domestic violence, in cases of assault, and all of these kinds of things, then absolutely not. This the point of it is not to say that, you know, just don't do anything about it. You know, if you're in a situation where yourself or somebody that you know or somebody that you're aware of is subject to violence, then you need to try to stop it. And one of the reasons, and you try to stop it, obviously, primarily for your own well-being or the well-being of the person who's the victim of violence, but you also do it because of your concern for the well-being of the person who's perpetrating the violence, because they're going to receive the results of their karma, which will be terrible for them. So this is not saying that we shouldn't try to stop violence, and it's not saying that we should just put up with it whenever it happens, but it's just talking about that kind of inner attitude of that monk at that particular time who is treating forbearance and patience as being the highest virtue. So finally, if they do stab you with a knife, what will you think of them then? If they stab me with a knife, I will think these people of Sunaparanta are gracious, truly gracious, since they don't take my life with a sharp knife. That's what I think. But if they do take your life with a sharp knife, what will you think of them then? If they take my life with a sharp knife, I'll think there are disciples of the Buddha who looked for someone to assist with slitting their wrists because they were horrified, repelled, and disgusted with the body and with life. And I have found this without looking. That's what I think, Blessed One. That's what I think, Holy One. So, well, that escalated quickly. And now we've reached this point where what? We've got Buddhist disciples actually looking to get killed. And of course, this is referring to a famous, if not notorious, episode which occurred in the Vinaya, where there was, it is recorded that this happened. Vinaya rules about taking human life. To be clear, the Buddha was not endorsing this practice, and it's not a Buddhist practice, and it's not about saying that this is any part of a Buddhist practice. In fact, it's quite contrary to the Buddhist practice, because the Buddha didn't endorse taking of life under any circumstances. But it did happen. And one of the things that it points to is that even in those extremes, when your life is taken either by yourself or by others, that isn't the end. That from a Buddhist point of view, this body is something that we inhabit for a time and then we move on. The important thing is our intention and our attitude towards that. In the case of somebody who has those kind of attitudes, those very kind of toxic and negative attitudes towards their body, then it can manifest in self-harm, in suicidality, and in various kinds of harmful behaviors. So the Buddha taught meditation on loving kindness, and specifically meditation on mindfulness of breathing, in order to develop a positive attitude and to overcome those toxic negative thoughts and attitudes towards the body. So the Buddha wraps up by saying, good, having such self-control and peacefulness, you'll be quite capable of living in Sunaparanta. Now, Purna, go at your convenience. Then Purna welcomed his words. He got up from his seat, bowed, respectfully circled the Buddha, keeping him on his right. He set his lodgings in order, and taking his bowl and robe, set out for Sunaparanta. Traveling stage by stage, he arrived at Sunaparanta and stayed there. So that must have taken several weeks of walking. Within that rainy season, he confirmed around 500 male and 500 female lay followers. And within that same rainy season, he realized the three knowledges. That is, he became, and sometime later, he became fully extinguished. Okay, so he became an arahant during that rains retreat and gathered all of these followers. Now, with these accounts of people's attainments and so on in the suttas, then these are one of the details that on the whole tends to vary the most from one version to another. So I wouldn't necessarily insist too literally on these things, but I think the main message here is that he did prosper in his spiritual practice and did ultimately realize arahantship, and that he did gain a large following while doing so. And this also, I think, is again a sort of a part of that story that the early Buddhists were telling themselves about how successful their teaching was or could be in a foreign country, as Sunaparanta was at that time. Then sometime later, he became fully extinguished. Right? So the Pali phrase here is aparena samayena. It's an indefinite period, but sometime after that rains retreat. Several mendicants went up to the Buddha and told him, "So the gentleman named Purna, who was advised in brief by the Buddha, has passed away. Where has he been reborn in his next life?" Mendicants, Purna was astute. He practiced in line with the teachings and did not trouble me with the teachings. Purna has become completely extinguished. That's what the Buddha was said, and the mendicants were happy with what the Buddha said. And so that's the end of the story, more or less. But I'm just going to add a couple of details to that, because there are a couple of very interesting details, or at least interesting to me, in the comparative study that I haven't mentioned so far. And I will just mention these briefly in passing. Okay. Right, according to the Mulasarasivada versions, that means according to the Divyavadana, the Sanskrit version we just looked, the Chinese version and the Tibetan versions, once he arrived in Sunaparanta, Purna met a hunter who, thinking that seeing a monk was inauspicious, got ready to attack Purna. So according to this version, it was actually true, right? The people there were rough and violent, and they did try to attack him. So, I mean, to me, it sounds a bit like kind of later editorializing, but anyway, that's what it says. And when seeing the hunter rush towards him, Purna bared his chest and told the hunter to strike right there. The hunter was so mollified by this reaction, he not only desisted, but listened to instructions and took the refuges and precepts. So, to me, that's a sort of typical sort of development that you find in the suttas, where something which is told more or less in the abstract in the first one. You can see that in the actual sutta, it's more by way of a kind of a parable about having patience and overcoming obstacles, and in the perhaps later versions, then that parable is then illustrated by a real life historical example that can bring with kind of a more vivid image to that teaching. And finally, the final detail that I'd like to mention here is that according to, and this is, I think, interesting, because according to the Divyavadana, the Chinese version, the Tibetan version, and according to the Pali commentary, there's another story about how Purna, with his psychic powers, rescued his brother and a group of merchants who were about to suffer misfortune in the midst of the sea. Following which they got a sandalwood building constructed for the Buddha and invited the Buddha to partake of a meal in that building. And the Buddha flew through the air with his psychic powers so that he could partake of that meal together with the monks. Now, so again, this kind of story, obviously, with this idea of the Buddha flying about from country to country with his psychic powers and so on, seems to be much more of a later addition. As far as we know, the Buddha basically walked and didn't take shortcuts when traveling. But the interesting thing here is how this story is shared in common, not just with the Mulasarvastivada traditions, but also with the Pali commentary. And so this is one of the things which shows how in those days, stories like this circulated generally within the community. And so even though by the time the Pali commentaries were compiled and edited, they were thousands of miles away from the Mulasarvastivadins, they were in distinctly different doctrinal schools with separate lineages and teachers and Abhidhamma philosophies and so on. And yet this story was shared and was considered common enough to be included. And so this is one of the things just to bear in mind, that when we're talking about the different schools of Buddhism, that in all of the periods of Buddhism, including today, that the different schools of Buddhism are sharing a lot of stories and teachings and ideas, even though they might be from different backgrounds. Okay, so that wraps up what I had to say about the Purnovada Sutta.